So this is a little hard for us to jump into because while there's information that I hopefully I can I can share with people every week, you know, this is an interesting one because oftentimes I think for people in the non-Orthodox world and the people who are living in a non-halachic, non-Jewish law uh, informed world, this is kind of for us in some cases a little bit of more of observation than participation. We all obviously are living under some Jewish law framework, but we don't look at it as law. When we talk about people who are, and I like to say not religious necessarily. I don't like to use that term because one can be very religious and spiritual and not necessarily be orthodox in practice. When we talk about someone who's Torah observant, we're really talking about, as I mentioned before, when we talk about Torah, in the loosest terms, following Jewish law as set forward in the Torah and then understood through the rest of the history of Jewish law, which is continuing to be written and if you will, revealed to this time. And for us as Jews, the revelation, when we talk about revelation, we're oftentimes talking about something very different than what other religions, especially Christianity, talks about with revelation. Because when Christianity is talking about revelation, especially the book of Revelation, it's a book about the end of the world. But it's not that the end of the world is revelation. It's that is revealed. That's a secret. That's a message that's revealed to people in a kind of in a way that hopefully helps people, but is to some extent, it's God given information that will, in some cases, especially maybe more in the Christian terms, it's how do you get into heaven? How do you talk to God? How do you connect with God? For Jewish law, it's like revelation is a day in, day out experience every day. How do I understand God's words? How do I understand God's mitzvot, the commandments? How do I keep them? And so, it's kind of weird that we say the word revelation because even as Jews, if we're kind of like more steeped in kind of non-Orthodox world, we don't think of it as a revelation necessarily, but it really is in the sense we believe that the Torah is continuously being revealed and understood. And that means like that God gave it in a form that allows for the layers to be peeled off and for things to be uncovered as they become necessary and as they become relevant. And that would mean, for example, our ancestors never had to understand or comprehend the idea of using an elevator on Shabbat. They didn't have elevators, they didn't have electricity, they didn't have 15-story buildings or whatever. So these weren't relevant practical issues. So when somebody says, okay, but do I use the elevator on Shabbat? Can I use an elevator where every floor will be stopped on, right? Which will happen if you're at Cedar Sinai Hospital here in LA, or if you're at a hotel in Israel on Shabbat, you can get in and out of an elevator and you don't have to press a button. Now, you and I would say, okay, that's an adaptation of Jewish law. That's a way that people figured out how to observe Shabbat, not use electricity, and still live in the modern world. But for people who are Torah observant, for almost all of them, that's a revelation. That was something that God gave us that we had to uncover, but was always there. And so I've had this discussion with Orthodox rabbis before, and they're steadfast in their belief that, look, if God is all knowing, that God is always knew everything that was going to happen, then God had things in the Torah that were there but just needed to be uncovered as people came to that experience where they needed that information. And so there it was. And so the job of the rabbis is to kind of peel those layers off and to find it, but that it is there. And of course, it's based on previous interpretations, previous understandings of the law, but that it was there all along. And so, I mean, I had a discussion when I was in rabbinical school. I had an Orthodox teacher teaching us, teaching my class about, certain concepts in Jewish law. And I said to him, and like everyone was challenging him, like, are space shuttle tiles in the Torah? Yes, they're in the Torah. So, like, you couldn't find something that he would never say it's not in the Torah. So there are people that operate within their understanding of Jewish law that this is just a matter of coming to the answers that are already there. So the process we talked about last week, we see it in the Talmud, and then we're going to see it this week developed in the later rabbinic writings. And so today I'm going to go back and forth between a few charts and a few timelines, because one of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering about 1,500 years of time from the time of the Talmud being finished to the modern era. And so as we go through these periods, I want you to kind of see what it is we're talking about. And we'll also look at some pages of the Talmud, because you'll see how the Talmud, as it was being published and as it was being kind of disseminated, it was being disseminated with the understanding that it also isn't just about what's on the page of Talmud, but what has also now been collected in the later commentaries. And so, as we said last week, it all starts with the Torah. And again, the laws have to be derived from the Torah. It's not that the prophets and writings aren't important. It's just the laws of the Torah have to be found in the 5 books. They can't be found in those books. They can refer to the people in the rest of the Bible, King David, Elijah. You could have different people, Jonah, where they're following the Torah, but they don't have laws that derive from the prophets and from the writings. And so what then happens is, as rabbinic teachings we mentioned last week are being collected orally, the rabbis decide that has to be written down in a book we call the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, as we mentioned, is organized thematically. It is a code of Jewish law, meaning it is got sections and it's got paragraphs, and like a law code has definitive rulings. But that is then added to by the Talmud. And again, for those who were not here last week, we actually have 2 different versions of the Talmud. The Yerushalmi, the one that was written in Jerusalem by the rabbis and the teachers who lived from about 200, because the Mishnah is finished around 200 of the Common Era. These people lived from about 200 to 500 in the land of Israel. And the Babylonian Talmud, by people who primarily live in Babylonia, which is not really Babylonia, it's Iraq and Iran. Those areas, they write a version. The real definitive version, as we mentioned, is the Bavli, because that's written for Jews that live in the diaspora, that don't live in Israel. I mentioned that it now, in the last 75 years, as Israel's been reestablished, yes, the Yerushalmi is studied more definitely by rabbis in Israel, because it deals with laws of agriculture and how to follow Jewish law in the land of Israel. So there's more and more focus on the Yerushalmi, but for the most of the last 1,500 years, it's been the Bavli. These books, these collections, Baraita and Tosefta, they're not really books, but they're collections of sayings and teachings that were not necessarily in the Mishnah. A lot of this work, a lot of these Baraita and Tosefta literature made their way into the Babylonian or Yerushalmi Talmud, but they were not necessarily all there. There are collections that of them that have kind of made their way into Jewish literature, but obviously, if they're in either of these 2 Talmuds, they're preserved, they're collected, and they're referred to, and people know them well. We then get into this next period, which is a little bit nebulous, because it doesn't conform to, let's say, one exact moment. But what we can say is, once the Babylonian Talmud was completed, especially in the Jewish community, and I said there is a geographical component to this. The Jews that lived in the Middle East, especially in Iran and Iraq, they started working on collecting, and many of the rabbis there and the two centers of learning in these communities in the Babylonian community were Sura, the city of Sura, and then Pumbedita, which were both capitals of Jewish learning in Iran during this period. And the Jewish academies in those cities wrote and collected teachings, mostly from their community, but occasionally from other communities that would ask questions or they heard things from other communities. They would collect these discussions. And remember, the Talmud is not a code, right? It actually almost destroys the code shape and texture of the Mishnah by having these long tangential decisions and discussions. And so what happens is this kind of continues to gather during this next period, and it really gathers in a series of what we sometimes will call she'elot utshuvot in Hebrew, but it's more well known in the world as responsa literature. Responsa meaning the responses that the rabbis would give to questions that people had that weren't necessarily exactly covered in the Talmud. And so these responsa, these questions and answers would be, again, usually in a form of a question, somebody asking a Jewish legal question of the rabbis there in the academies. And then they would give the answers, they would write them, they would compose them, send them back to the community. And in some cases, of course, they kept those. And some of those were sent out and collected and kept in other places, especially in places like North Africa and in Spain, and where some of the new Jewish communities were growing during the Middle Ages. So again, this period of time, I'm going to show you real quick another thing we're going to go back and forth on, which is this wonderful little chart. And what's great about this chart is there's a lot going on here. It's got a timeline, right? It's got a timeline showing what kinds of things were going on in the world and which Jewish leaders and rabbis we're talking about, which books are being written. So, for example, here we have the Jerusalem Talmud written around here, the Babylonian Talmud written right about here, and what we call those people. So we call the people who wrote the Mishnah Tanaim. We call the people that the rabbis that are quoted in the Talmud, we call them Amoraim. And we call these people who start collecting these teachings after the Talmud is finished, the Savoraim, who are actually the people who actually kind of completed the Talmud, completed it and canonized and decided how it was going to be organized, and also the Gaonim. And the Gaonim are the people who are collecting these teachings and are definitely post the Talmud is finished. And again, what's going on in this time is that you have the beginning of Islam. Islam is right here with Muhammad. You have in these communities that would eventually kind of be overrun by Islam, you have the rabbis of this period that we're going to talk about. Sadia Gaon, who's the most famous of the Gaonim. Sadia was his name, Gaon is his title. Then we go into Rashi, Yehuda Levi, Maimonides, and Nachmanides, Ramban. And these guys live during the Middle Ages, early part of the Middle Ages. And what's really cool about this chart is it also shows you where the Jewish community was living. And so it's color coded. So the blue is when Jews are living. These are Jews living in the land of Israel, percentage wise too. You can see it reflected. So here's where Jews are living now. The green area you can see right here is Europe. The yellow is us, United States. So you see it starting to grow here, but of course it doesn't exist back here. And the other part here is the orange. This is North Africa and the Middle East, primarily. Areas that are under the Islamic rule. And you can see that during this period, we're talking about the Middle Ages, the Jewish community in Israel is fairly small, but the community in North Africa, in Asia, Middle East is very large. The Jewish community in Europe is not very large yet. It's going to start getting large right about here. And then, of course, by the time we get to the beginning of the modern period, through the Renaissance period, and then kind of like through the Enlightenment period, that's when the green part, that's Europe, gets so big. And then, of course, you can see the United States here, whereas Europe is not that much. United States is pretty big. So this is a great chart and timeline and graph, if you will, to kind of show us what's happening with, and this is up on now on the website under the materials for the classes. You can actually download this and have this by your side. It's a really good like chart that has everything on it. Maybe it has too much information, but it's really great to be able to kind of show people what the Jewish community looks like, geographically, and again, what's happening in history during this time. So you can see, by the way, too, back here, when Israel is during the time of, and we don't know for sure, we were talking about it yesterday, about the Jewish community during the time of King David. They put it here about 5 million. It's probably a little less. It's probably closer to about here, but it's okay. I mean, the numbers that we have are probably written by people who live in this period. They're kind of like imagining the numbers, but it is interesting that about the time of the birth of Christianity, that during the time of Jesus, we put our population pretty close to about 5 million in the world, which you can see at the time, pretty well split between Israel and the rest of North Africa and Asia, the Mediterranean area primarily. You can see it's almost 50-50. And then after the destruction, and then after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish community in Israel goes really small. And then you can see how big the Jewish community in North Africa and Iran and Iraq and that area gets bigger. Again, people sometimes call them Sephardic Jews. It's not really true to call them Sephardic Jews because they're Mizrahi Jews. They're Jews who, for the most part, follow a tradition that's closer to Sephardic Judaism, but they're not Spanish Jews. The Spanish Jews were Jews that lived in and would be in this green bar here. And the interesting thing about the green is that it includes Europe, right? But the green here is primarily Spain and France. And then right about here, when the Jewish community is given rights in Poland, this is mostly Poland and Russia, where most of our ancestors lived. And so here you can see what happens during the Holocaust, this huge Jewish population that's essentially wiped out right there. It's murdered right in that period. So you can see the Jewish population still at this time right now is not probably what it was before the Holocaust because of what happened in Europe. So yes, there was a tremendous growth in the Jewish community from about 1700 to about 1900. The Jewish population exploded during that period. It's almost unheard of, that kind of growth. That's where a lot of our families lived. So back to this chart real quick. Any questions, by the way? Sorry about that chart. I'm gonna jump into this chart then. Back here again.
What
So
does the IM ending mean?
oh, so that's plural, right? So when we
Okay.
say gaonim, that's a plural, right? So rishonim, it's the first big guys. They're not first generation, they're first big guys. A rishon is one, and rishonim. The arba turim, we're going to talk about in a moment. Yeah, anything with im at the end is plural. So we're talking about what's happening with the Gaonic period. We don't know a lot about the history of this period. The Gaonim are not really writing a lot of history. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of what was going on during this time. It's kind of it's almost like we have to assemble the history through their discussions. We just really don't know, generally because it was pretty calm. Jewish community in Iran, and again, Iran and Iraq during that period of time, controlled by Zoroastrians, were generally pretty overall. There's always some exceptions, but overall very tolerant of Judaism and very accepting of the Jews, religiously fairly tolerant. That's going to come to an explosive end when Islam comes out of Arabia and destroys the Zoroastrian empires of Persia, and those countries all become Muslim. It was not always bad under Islam in those areas. I want to make it clear that in many cases, for much of the next 1,200 years, you were safer in not all the time, but generally safer for 1,200 years under Persian authority than you were under, let's say, French or German authority, which kind of depended on which king or which bishop was in charge of your future. Because in some cases, you had to leave France or you had to leave Germany. The Jews were all expelled. We have persecutions of Jews in Iran, but for the most part, the Jewish community was intact and whole for 2,000 years in Iran until the Shah was deposed. There's a reason for that, because people were generally safe. And during this period, they were very safe. And so we don't know a lot about it because there just wasn't a lot of conflict. It was just calm. And when things are calm, that's generally where we don't have the history, especially when it comes to the Jewish community. Maybe it's partly because we don't have kings, we don't have dynasties after this period. And so we don't really have like history books where we're going to hear about, the lineage of, or the fights between one kingdom or one prince and another. We don't have those things. So we don't have a lot of history from this period. It's difficult to kind of assemble the history. I've taken classes in this period, and it's like there's nothing to say. We look at the letters that people were writing, trying to figure out, how their economy ran and how they worked with the Jewish institutions, especially the institutions of learning, the academies. But there's not a lot. I mean, we're kind of like piecing it together. So when we kind of get to this next period we call the Rishonim, this is where we start to see, number one, as I showed you on that chart, there's a difference, a little difference between what's going on in the North African community and what's happening in what will now be the Eastern realm, so to speak, of where these academies were, and the Western area where Spain and North Africa are. And what we have during this period, we call the Rishonim period, is we have the development of really now Sephardic traditions of the Jews of Spain, who are very, very strong internally. They have a system of kind of self-governance where the Christian authority of Spain allowed them in. And remember, Spain was overrun by the Muslims during this period, and so there's a Muslim caliphate in Spain that's very tolerant of the Jews there too. And that works for a long time until, again, it doesn't. And the persecutions that start originally in Spain were not the Christian persecutions. They were persecutions of Muslims on Jews. And one of those people that gets caught in that as a young child is this guy that we know of as Maimonides, Rambam. And Maimonides leaves Spain with his family. They flee Spain. We believe that they were forcibly, by the way, converted to Islam for a while. They came to North Africa, which was also Muslim, but it was a more tolerant uh, um, Islamic caliphate. And they were able to, once again, they were able to practice their Judaism. And Maimonides lived in that North African community and became one of the greatest teachers of all Jewish history. And he was a doctor, he was a philosopher, he was very influenced by the Islamic teachings of the time, which were very, in their own way, influenced by Greek philosophers, because the Muslims had taken in a lot of the Greek philosophy that had been preserved in Europe and in North Africa, and were very they were very encouraging of philosophy. This is again around 1000. Now, Maimonides lives right around this period, and Maimonides is he does something that is quite brilliant, which is he decides to try to codify Jewish law as it's been taught up until about this period, up till about the 1100s. And so he creates what's called the Mishneh Torah, which is, and again, you can see it here on, you can see it here in where he lives. And can we get it up here a little bit? You can see it right here on this chart, the Mishneh Torah. Now, this is a code like the Mishnah was, which is why it's called the Mishneh Torah, which means a teaching, a repetition, if you will, of the Torah. But the Mishneh Torah, as opposed to the Mishnah, is collected, it's edited into, Maimonides edits it into 14 books, and it covers subjects like the Mishnah did. And so it's arranged by subject. So there's a tractate on repentance that we oftentimes refer to when we get to the high holidays. There's a tractate on how to calculate the phases of the moon. There's a tractate on what a Jewish king would do, which is interesting because during his time there were no Jewish kings really, but like what would a Jewish king do? What are the laws of governance, if you will, under Jewish law? So his collection of the Mishneh Torah, it's also nicknamed, it's sometimes called the Yad Hazakah, which means the mighty hand. And the reason it's called Yad Hazakah is because Yud Daled is 14. And so it's got 14 books. This was a tremendous addition to our understanding of Jewish law because he collected it in a way that people could refer to it. Maimonides was also a very rational philosopher. He was very influenced by, as I said, the Muslim philosophers, and he really tried to make sure that Judaism was understandable, was coherent, and works as a system. He was very against Jewish mysticism. He did not like superstitions. He was very against talismans and amulets, which were very popular then and sometimes are today. He didn't like the kinds of Kabbalistic teachings that people were doing then and will soon be codified in the Zohar, not too far from where he used to live in Spain. The guy wanted Judaism to be seen as almost like a science, that there's a logic to it, and that even the miracles in the Bible can be explained and understood as acts of a coherent omnipotent and logical God. And so Maimonides definitely had that in his philosophical teachings. His most famous book is called The Guide for the Perplexed, right? Which is you're perplexed after you read it because it's written at such a high level. It's difficult to even understand today. It is amazing how much he wrote. It's amazing how much this guy was responsible for during this period of time, because he also did work as a physician. He treated people, and he said he worked all day, as a physician as well. So he was a brilliant man. Lived in North Africa for the most of his life, though he was born in Cordoba. He was born in Spain. The Spain that he was born into, it went through an Islamic, almost like a coup, where very, very, almost like you would say jihadist Muslims took over and made it very hard for Christians and for Jews to function in that country. But up until that time, Cordoba had been a very, very important city for learning, and where people of all cultures came together. 1,000 years ago, remember, in about 1,000 of the Common Era, Cordoba was the most advanced city in the world. It was. I mean, it was far more important from an academic level than London or I mean, maybe there were some places in China that had this level of learning and cross-cultural influences. Cordoba was an amazing city 1,000 years ago in Spain. And so that's the kind of world that Maimonides was born into, but it does fall apart, partly because of this Islamic takeover, and also, I mean, not takeover, but this other Islamic dynasty that starts there. But quite frankly, the fighting between Christians and Muslims inside Spain is going to get very bad, and Jews are kind of caught in the middle. They're neither one, and so they try to just find a safe haven, and of course, that'll wind up ending during the Inquisition. But this is before that. This is a world that, again, was for a long time a wonderful place to live for Jews in Spain. Now, this Mishneh Torah it becomes one of the foundations for Jewish law. But what also is happening here, and I'm going to show you right now, is as the Talmud is being taught, and here's the page of the Talmud. You've got an interesting situation here, which is, hold on one second. This is the first page of the Talmud, the very first page. But it's a great page to kind of take you through. Now, this is the edition we call the Vilna edition, which wasn't finished until the 1800s, but we can start to see, even in the Middle Ages, that the Talmud each page of the Talmud becomes not just a place where we read the original law from the Mishnah. I'm going to show you now a color-coded version of this, what's going on this page. This top part here is the actual Mishnah. This is the text from the early rabbis. This was finished by about 200 of the Common Era. This part here, that's the top kind of pinkish part. The part here below in the orange is the Gemara from the rabbis who lived from the 200s to the 500s. Okay, and then on every page of the Talmud, we'll have an inside piece. Again, on the Vilna edition, we'll have this piece in here, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara. And sometimes it's just the Gemara, because there's a lot more Gemara than there is Mishnah, right? So it's much longer, the Gemara. We'll have pages and pages of Gemara on one Mishnah. But when you see that page, and again, one of the things you have to do in rabbinical school is you have to decipher. I mean, don't have to decipher it because every page has certain clues so you know what you're looking at. But the inside part, you're all learning how to read a page of Talmud right now. The inside part is the Mishnah and then the Gemara, and then the commentary around it is part of how Jewish law develops. Because on this side right here, in the greenish blue, we have the comments of Rashi, who lives, and again, Shlomo ben Yitzchak, his acronym is Rashi, just like the acronym for Maimonides is Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. That's the acronym. Rashi is the acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. He lives in France, and he lives just before Rambam, and he's a very important commentator. But rather than codify or kind of collect commentaries or laws, he will do the commentary. And so he has this wonderful commentary on the Talmud. And it's written in a different script. Can't see it very well, but this is traditional Aramaic Hebrew script. And then we have what's called the Rashi script, which you can tell where Rashi is because it's written in this different kind of Hebrew script. And his is on this side. And then on this side, we have the commentary of the Tosafists who live after him. And this is this blue part here. These are rabbis who are actually his son-in-laws. Rashi has daughters. There's actually a series of books called Rashi's Daughters. Rashi's daughters are married to several prominent rabbis. They become what we call the Tosafists. They're collectors of teachings and laws. And so when the Talmud says something, they want to explain it, just like Rashi did. They want to explain it and try to help us understand how we keep it. These guys lived in France and Germany, his son-in-laws, and then some of these are also his grandsons. Their children, the son-in-law and daughters, kids, they also become commentators. So these commentators live in what we would call the beginnings of the Ashkenazi community. And so we start to have these commentaries. And one of the things that Rashi and his son-in-laws and grandsons do is they start to translate some of these words, not necessarily into German, but they start to translate into Rashi's language, which is French. So we start to get European languages and start to get European attitudes, if you will, too, on these texts. As Jews in Europe are now starting to comment a little bit more too. The other colors we have around here are some of the other commentaries. Here we have this yellow one here is Rabbi Nissim ben Yaakov, who's from Tunisia, from North Africa. And then these commentaries over here, these purple ones, these are not commentaries, but you can see they're kind of letters. These are, both of these, the light purple and dark purple, these are references to other places in the Talmud where similar ideas will be found. So these are kind of like hyperlinks to other parts of the Talmud. So you can read more about it in these other sections. So these aren't commentaries, but they are things that help us understand. And then the last thing I'm going to show you right here is this really important thing called Ein Mishpat, Ner Mitzvah, which means the well of law, the candle of the commandments, the light of the commandments. This contains links to other places in Jewish law, including Maimonides' collection, the Mishneh Torah, but now very important into the books that we're going to talk about now, which are these books called the Arba Turim and the Shulchan Aruch. Now, these books are super important because these are now back to like what Maimonides was doing. These are collections of laws that help us understand Jewish law. And again, these were written by Jews in Europe and in I would say Asia, but the Middle East. Joseph Caro actually lives in Israel, in the land of Israel. He lives in Tzfat. And these rabbis in these periods are trying to do what the rabbis in the Mishnah were doing, which is we got to get this all together in a place where people can just say, hey, what do I do on Shabbat? How do I light the candles? How do I make sure something's kosher? How do I make sure a knife is kosher? The laws they're all over the place. How do we get it all together in one place? And so that's what the Arba Turim do. And then the next version of that is the one that we really still use today, is called the Shulchan Aruch. And that goes back literally 400 years. But I will tell you that this book is super important for us because the code that is written out during that period is already post-Christian, post-Muslim, and there's even now, again, if you will, the understanding that the Jewish community lives all over the world, and as they start to, and again, this is written in the 16th century, beginning of the Renaissance period, people are starting to be challenged by, okay, the world is expanding around us. It's not flat. We're constantly learning new things. And so we have to be prepared for not just what we're going to know now, what we know now, but we have to be able to be prepared to answer questions about what's going to happen in what's around the corner, which is this kind of modern world. And so the Shulchan Aruch is still used by Jews to understand and to kind of make sense of Jewish law. And people will still go to the Shulchan Aruch. They'll still turn to that book as a guide for Jewish law. And it's really interesting because it's not like they don't look at the Talmud, but if somebody wants to know how to do something, like how to keep some aspect of Jewish law, they'll turn to the Shulchan Aruch. They'll turn to that book to, to understand how to keep Jewish law. Now, the cool thing is, I'm going to show you right now, the Shulchan Aruch is available, if you probably guessed it, it's available on Sefaria. So Sefaria has the Mishneh Torah, which is the legal code that was done by Maimonides in about the 12th century, the 1100s. Then it has the Tur, which is the one I told you, is divided into 4 sections, the Arba Turim. And then it says right there, it is the book upon which the Shulchan Aruch is based. And that is what we have here. I just opened it up for you. There's 4 sections, 4 books. Just like I told you, there's 6 sections of the Mishnah. There's 14 sections to Mishneh Torah. Oh, you know what? While I have you here, I'm just going to show you the Mishneh Torah, right? So here's the sections of the Mishneh Torah. So you can see these are the sections that you have. Starts here with Sefer Madah, which includes those things, gets into Sefer Ahava, the book of love, which you could say is really like prayers. And you get into the holidays. So these are the sections. And again, some of them are really interesting because it deals with the sacrifices, even though it seems very far away. But he also deals with the laws of Jewish kings and wars. What would that, by the way, I didn't say before. Look, when we're talking about Jewish combat, Jewish war ethics, there's a lot of people that'll turn to Maimonides because he talks about it, and he's one of the few people that talked about it. And it was very theoretical during his time, but because he talked about it, you see. So back to the Shulchan Aruch, though, there's 4 sections. And again, these 4 sections are laid out in the Tur too. I'll just show you. Orach Chaim is the first. Uh, these
Rabbi,
rocks.
when was all this completed?
So the tour was the 14th century, and the Shulchan Aruch is about the 16th century. But I was going to show you the same four sections. The same four sections are in the tour, are in the Shulchan Aruch. So you couldn't have the Shulchan Aruch without the tour, but it was a little less comprehensive and a little less. I mean, today nobody really looks at the tour by itself because the Shulchan Aruch is like the expansion of that and the version that people will look at. So today, for example, like I have the Shulchan Aruch in my house. Every Orthodox, well, I should say everywhere. I don't want somebody to say, I know an Orthodox person doesn't have it, but virtually every Orthodox person that I know who follows Jewish law, and remember, Orthodox doesn't mean necessarily religious, as I said before. The word doesn't even mean religious or spiritual. The word Orthodox means ortho, meaning correct or strict or following like orthopedics, right? Ortho and dox, which means dogma, teachings, right? So it's the Orthodox, it's following the teachings, it's following the law. It's not necessarily, again, necessarily religion or practice. Orthodoxy by definition means a strict practice. So almost every person I know who's trying to follow Jewish law seriously will have the Shulchan Aruch in their homes. And again, like me, I'll use the translation all the time of the Shulchan Aruch. But yes, almost every home has it. And there's even another like later version of it, which I'll show you just real quickly. It's called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is the short version of it right here.
Would you say this is the basis for common law?
This is not a basis for common law. No, it's a basis for Jewish law. And the reason the reason why it's not common law is because it's not just because it's not dealing with it's not dealing just with I mean, there is obviously, I'll show you. Well, actually, it's not going to say that there, but in the Shulchan Aruch, so for example, here's the sections. Okay. So Yoreh Deah is section of the Shulchan Aruch, which is dealing with specifically kinds of the things that a ritual butcher would have dealt with, or what a lot of the rabbis would have dealt with. How do people follow the laws of menstruation, for example, and that also, by the way, is covered a little bit in Even HaEzer, and each of these words, means something. Orach Chaim means the length of days. Even HaEzer means the stone of help. All of these words, they mean something, but they're based on the fact that these sections, like Even HaEzer, is going to be. I mean, obviously, the rabbi has to be familiar with this, so he understands how to properly give a get. But most of these laws are derived from the Talmud, but now they've been reorganized. They've been focused. I'm just going to turn to a random page. This is similar to what you'd see in some common law stuff, but this is, for example, what a judge would do when they come when they're dealing with how to choose which cases. Well, in this case, it happens to be in this page. It happens to be how they prioritize cases. But again, you can see it also goes into some legal theory of how they interrogate witnesses, of how they investigate, background on the litigants. So
how is this applied today?
So it's a great question. How does it apply today? So when somebody goes to an Orthodox rabbi today, as much as they'll use the Talmud as a basis for, they'll want to know that there's something in the Talmud about it. They really go to the Shulchan Aruch first, and they'll find out what the answer is from the Shulchan Aruch. Now, they'll also, in many cases, because, if it's a simple answer, doesn't take into consideration modern conveniences and modern, things that nobody really accounted for during the 1600s, then they're going to have to do something else, which I'll show you. But for the most part, if it's a question of something that's, a fairly timeless issue, but again, we're not going to turn to the Talmud or the Torah for the answer. They're actually going to turn to the Shulchan Aruch, which is going to have pretty much the authoritative and definitive answer on how to deal with something. Again, if it's not complicated by, modern situations. If it does, well, before I do that, let me just show you something real quick. Back to the chart. So you can see, so you have the Shulchan Aruch here, and you can see the fact that again, it's the same names because these are the same sections. If we look at the timeline, you can see we have more people that we would refer to, the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, the Chasam Sofer. But if you see of the books, right? Here you have the Arba Turim, and then in 1400s, and then you have 1600s, you have Shulchan Aruch. All of these things that are here, none of these are books anymore. Yeah, they're legal books. They're not the definitive books on these happen to be, this is a philosophical tractate, Rome and Jerusalem. Moreh Nevuchim is Maimonides. That's why it's written by these guys in it's coded with the orange because of where they lived. But yeah, look, there's really nothing after this that's the book that you got to look at. So this is where people will turn first when a rabbi is asked a question. They'll turn to the Shulchan Aruch, but that's of course not the end, because you could see if you look under halacha, there's other stuff that comes after that. As I said, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was really popular and is kind of an abridged. That's what it means. Kitzur means the shortened Shulchan Aruch. It's kind of a summary version, and I would say I think it was really designed for people that were not rabbis, that didn't need to have every single law, but like really the practical laws and kind of a quicker version of it. They didn't have to necessarily give legal answers. But you can see here, these are other collections of Jewish law. But let me show you real quick right here, which is now we get to the responsa. Back to the responsa, because now, after the Shulchan Aruch, and by the way, we're going to talk about what also happens during this time, not today, but in another class, because as the Shulchan Aruch is written by the same people who are writing around Caro, and Caro was definitely influenced by him, and we've gone to the Caro synagogue in Sfat before. Right next to there is the Ari synagogue, the Lurianic synagogue, which was the synagogue of the Kabbalists. So as much as I told you, Maimonides didn't want to have that stuff around him, Joseph Caro, the compiler of the Shulchan Aruch, and the people who lived in Sfat were definitely influenced by the mystical. So much so, and again, we're not going to talk about it today, but I need to tell you one thing about Caro, is that Caro believed that the helper of his writings of the Shulchan Aruch and his muse, if you will, wasn't really a muse, it was an angel. So he really believed that he was composing this with divine help. And again, it's not a mystical work. The Shulchan Aruch does not dabble in that kind of stuff. But he believed that he was really working with divine assistance as he was putting this together. So now, after the Shulchan Aruch and after this kind of like, okay, we have this, then there's a question of, well, what now? Now, one could argue somebody should do now in the year, as we go through the 2000s, it's about time for one of these things to be done. But for the Orthodox world, they're still chugging along with the Shulchan Aruch and with what we call these responsa. What's interesting is there are responsa in every movement, because here is, for example, the Reform movement's responsa. That's right. And I have it on the sheet that I'll share right now for you. You can look, I have links to this. You can look at the Shulchan Aruch, a little bit more about those on the Wikipedia pages if you want. Of course, all of these texts are on Sefaria, but there are the links for the different responsa. So let's take a look. The Reform movement maintains this on the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. These used to be collections of books that would come out every so often. They would publish Reform responsa. And you can see, what are some of the responsa? Well, they go back, and this is all done in alphabetics. If you go to epidemics, I don't even see anything. Let's see it. This is stuff that had to do with AIDS, actually. But I'll tell you what's an interesting one here. Well, look at this one, see? Electronic eavesdropping. So there's a question. Now, the people who answer this, in this case, there isn't somebody who left their sometimes these will say who wrote the responsa, but look what the Reform movement does. Okay, it answers the question, and of course it's going to quote, here's the Tur, well, here's the Talmud, here's Maimonides, that's the Mishneh Torah, here's the Tur, told you the Shulchan Aruch, and to answer back to John's question, look, it's not enforceable necessarily. You can't say, well, the rabbis have told us that you're not supposed to do, Well, look, it doesn't say whether it should be held in a court of law. It says, should eavesdropping be used when we're talking about Jewish law and Jewish tradition? But, look, there's an interesting discussion. Let's just see. I'll just show you one thing here. So look. There's a discussion here about look there. Can you name a sanctuary after a departed member? So here's a discussion about it, right? There's the responsa. The conservative movement does something similar, except the conservative movement does something a little bit different. which is that, of course, because it's a little bit more traditional, theirs is maintained by the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the organization of conservative rabbis. What's interesting about the way they do it is that they will, you can sort it by who wrote the teshuva, the response. But what I think is really interesting is look what so they organize it by, conversion holidays, kashrut, life cycle, etc. But look what they also do. See, Orach Chaim, Yoreh De'ah, Evan HaEzer, Choshen Mishpat. They use the same categories that the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch did. So again, if you go to Yoreh De'ah, it's going to have things like kosher slaughter. Look at this one. What are we going to do about tattooing, right? This one's from 1997. Here's the question. And here's the teshuvah, the response. See? So here's the discussion.
Are you telling me that a person that's tattooed is not going to be buried in a Jewish cemetery?
I didn't say that.
Read that though. I mean, you're going quickly, but I was able to see enough to say that, right? The prohibition against this found in the Torah. Scroll down.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
Okay, but here's the interesting question, right? It says right here, burial in a Jewish cemetery, right? Now, I opened this one because I knew you'd find, I knew everyone would find this interesting. But here's the question, right?
Oh, it's all interesting, actually.
Right?
Those maybe buried. So it's an exception to the rule. So then my question is, and this is wonderful. I mean, we could go. You're right. We could be studying this stuff forever, because this is actually very interesting. But what? Two questions. Does this assist in modern day, right? Or is this an exercise by the rabbis for them to do something?
So,
and then where's Rabbi Blazer's response in the Reform movement?
So I turn to these responsa when people ask me questions about Jewish law. Doesn't happen a lot, but if it does, I know that I can go to these. I know that in most cases, and this is one that I'll get asked about tattooing, and this is the answer that I say. Jews should remember that we're created b'tselem Elohim, right? Which is, we're created in the divine image. We treat our body as a gift from God. And so we definitely enhance, nobody's going to say we can't enhance our bodies, right? But do we enhance our bodies in a way that's going to be, because again, where's the, where do you draw the line with this, right? And I say, what we always use as our principle is that our body is a gift from God. And so, desecrating our bodies is something that we don't do, but enhancing our bodies is something that we would do. Now, I'm not going to summarize this whole piece because it's from 1997. There's been more that's been added to this. And I think the Reform movement has also, let me just put in the, no, this is, I'm just looking to see. These are all of the ones that, yeah, right? Look at this one. Congregant plans reconstructive breast surgery, right? This is not you understand? So these are questions that the rabbis continue to be faced with. And as I said, the Orthodox ones, though, can be found within the on Sepharia. So this is on Sepharia. So if you look at the bottom here, in addition to all these other books here, we were looking at Halakha, which included the Mishneh Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, all there. You do a deep dive, and here you can look at the Rishonim, the responses of the Gaonim, the Rishonim, and the Achronim, which are the most modern ones. The last people are the Achronim. So these are, well, actually, no, they have a separate one for just modern, for people who are in the last, 50 years or so. So understand that because, as I mentioned at the beginning, at the outset, the Gaonim start these answers, right? So here's the Sharira Gaon, right? These are these are collections that go back literally 1400 years ago, right? So here's discussions. Not all of these are translated.
Go to that first section back again. That was pretty interesting.
Hold on one second.
You're going quickly, but that was pretty interesting.
I know.
If a business owner I guess from a business owner did something and I left with Chinese prime.
Yeah.
Now, this is good stuff. This is fun stuff.
So yeah, these are the discussions that start again for us. And again, we're going to look at some of these other sections later on. We're going to talk about Jewish, liturgy. We're going to talk about prayers. We're going to talk about the Kabbalah. But when we talk about halakha, it also includes this part right here, the responses. So it's really, I would say, there's always been this kind of tension in when it comes to Jewish law, which is we can respond to, well, let me say this. Now that we have computers, responsa are phenomenal. They're wonderful. But when we didn't have them, we had to take those responses essentially, and we had to dilute we had to reconfigure them. We had to kind of cut and paste some of this to get out we had to distill the answer, if you will, or the practical teaching, and then put it in a way that people could find. And so that we were constantly doing that with these law codes, whether it was the Mishneh Torah or whether it was the Shulchan Aruch. So asking questions and having the response were always kind of like the basis for these things, but there was no way to collect all these things. And so they had to be, throughout history, we've collected them and kind of put them in a book, and then that book would then, we'd have the answers. And so now it's almost as if we could do, you could have, your Ask the Rabbi on the internet, and it's wonderful. I already looked it up. It's already been done, but it's actually one of the addresses people are just sitting at. They're just sitting on. They've parked it. But what I thought would be awesome, of course, is the RABBAI, the rabbi, RABBAI,
Of course, AI.
the AI rabbi. And reality is that's what we could do now, which is amazing, which is take the compendiums, right? The indexed versions of Jewish law, the codes, pop in all of the responsa, and including the ones that are just being written now, put that all together, and then have an output where the AI answer is actually, bringing together the codes and the answers, the response answers all together, which is something that, we've never been able to do. and is really it's really an amazing thing. I will tell you that one of the reasons why I showed you the geographical timeline as well is because there definitely was an influence over what's happening, and that's why we didn't talk about it a lot, because it's not the what we're talking about today. We are going to talk about Jewish history. We'll cover everything that's on this chart, but the history and the geography and what was going on in the world around people definitely influenced their laws and their answers. It has to. It always does. I mean, how can I not give an answer based on my experiences as a Jew that's lived now into the 21st century? It's impossible for me to separate myself from my experiences and from my cultural influences. It's impossible. So what's really wonderful is that we have this now, this ability to kind of like, well, let's be honest about it, right? Let's put it out there, and as I said, I don't get asked a lot of times questions about Jewish law, but I think and let me say this, it's oftentimes the same kinds of questions. It'll be questions about things like tattooing. It'll be questions about, uh, marriage, divorce kinds of situations. By the way, usually divorce kinds of questions. The marriage questions, no, that's not true. Oh, the marriage questions are the marriage questions are the marriage questions uh, are there. And again, a lot of them have to do with the fact that, like, if one of the partners is not Jewish, do we have to do this or do we have to do that? And those are questions that, an Orthodox rabbi is not going to really answer, because they're going to say, you just don't do it. So it's not an issue. But again, and that's where the divorce stuff comes in, is, someone will ask me flat out, do I have to get a get? Well, if you're not Jewish, no, you don't have to get a get, because your marriage is annulled from the Jewish standpoint. Anyways, if your Jewish spouse wants to get remarried, they don't need a get from you, because you weren't Jewish in the first place. So those are like legitimate questions that people ask me, and I get asked those questions more frequently than any other type of question. Will be those types of questions. And look, I will tell you that maybe we get to a point where, look, I don't know that AI is going to give the same type of, I mean, I'm sure it could give the same type of answer, but part of it has always been, to me, what is the answer? It's not that everybody gets a different answer at all. I mean, I would say my answers are usually consistent, but the answers for people who don't live in an Orthodox world where there's a consequence to not following Jewish tradition would be different. And I mean, like, I'm honest about it. It's like, it matters if the question of whether you have a get or not matters if you marry somebody who's Orthodox. It doesn't matter if you marry somebody who's not Orthodox, they're not going to care. So that's why I'm saying it kind of depends on, why the person's asking and what they're going to do, like, what's their next step. And so it's not just about, like, what's the answer? It's what's the answer, because what else is happening? And, part of why these responses were kept was because they really were not so situational. They applied to lots of people, and that's why they got kept. So if it was such an esoteric, unique situation, who cares? You don't need to know. Like, who'd ever ask the question again? But if it's a question that, like, a lot of people are going to ask that question, yeah, let's have an answer, and let's be able to retrace our steps and go back to that answer. So,
Do you think there'll be an AI that is geared to the Orthodox, and then one that's geared to, I mean, I don't know if I'm even asking this question right, but one that's geared to the Reform and that kind of thing? Because, like,
what I think will happen in the Orthodox world, and I think it's already happening, is that people are popping this stuff in already in especially in like Israel, where they obviously have a very high level of I mean, they're making breakthroughs regularly on quantum computing and on they've been making, obviously it's a highly technological place for even within the Orthodox world. Again, it's not that every Orthodox person is going to use all the technology that's available to them because they don't want to have some of the social media stuff that we have, and I salute them for that, by the way. Now I'm a firm believer that they're actually they're right about that. But no, I here's the thing. I think that rabbis in Israel are already popping these things into the computer, but they're not going to say, well, the computer told me this answer. They're going to say, oh, well, the computer helped me get those answers. It helped me find what the tour said and what Maimonides said. And so it'll help. They're using it as a resource to help them get those answers. They're not afraid to do that. And they trust the sources enough that they don't have to open up a book to say, well, I saw it in a book. So they are using the computers now, but I think they're not going to say, hey, the computer is the final answer on this. They're going to still say it has to be like it has to be go through the last way it comes out to us is through a person. So I don't think they're going to, you can make the argument. I know what you're saying is like, maybe it should, because those people, the computer would be dispassionate and would just give you the answer, not like, be either, swayed by something that they shouldn't be, or, have some reaction to the person or whatever, it hit the, let's just say the rabbi is asked by somebody whether their child who married somebody who isn't Jewish, whether they should allow them to come back for, a Jewish holiday. I mean, I don't know what the example would be, but let's just say that it's a question like that, or one that I know happened, where somebody married their daughter, an Orthodox rabbi, their daughter married someone who converted in a conservative conversion, and the father didn't accept it. It's my dog. So the question, so the rabbi who had to make that answer, who had to make that decision, what if he had a daughter who did the same thing and he disowned her? And I know somebody who did this. I mean, I know the daughter who got disowned. So if the rabbi gets asked the question and it hits home a little too much, right? He's personally upset by it, then his answer might be affected by his own personal experience. And so I think a computer could potentially, not have that problem. So you can make the argument that that's a good thing that could happen through a computerized version of these. But I will tell you this. I know that in the Orthodox world, that, I mean, they're the ones who've put all these, the Orthodox folks are the ones who've put up all these commentaries. No, I shouldn't say that. I mean, everybody has turned to them, but I know that there are Orthodox Jews working on making these commentaries accessible, computer. So I'll give you another example. So up until recently, there's an issue, for example, in order to get a decision on Jewish law, and I'll give you a really concrete example of this. In order to let's say a woman was declared an aguna, which is a chained woman, right? Her husband won't give her a get, right? That was a real issue. A woman wasn't given a get by her husband, and there was no way to get it from him because he left the area. Because in the old days, what happened is if a man refused to give his wife a get, the men of that town would gather together and take that guy to the back of the shed and beat him until he gave the get. Seriously, that's what would happen. It still happens in Orthodox communities that are insular and have the ability, and the person doesn't leave the community. But if the person leaves the community, you can't do that anymore. If the guy did it in Israel and left his wife in Israel and won't give her a get, what are you going to do, right? It was a problem, and the woman was called an aguna. Well, there's a rule that if you have a letter signed by 100 rabbis that say that this woman is free from this man. It's called it's a decision, mea rabbanim, 100 rabbis. The woman could be freed. Now, I remember 20 or 30 years ago, you couldn't do that. You could start to do it, and people were starting to do it. They would fax a letter. They would fax the letter to 100 people, 100 rabbis, and it would go around, and they would have the rabbis all sign it. And that's how it started. But now you can do a DocuSign. You have 100 rabbis sign a letter, and it's done. Done. So the technology is being used by the Orthodox today in a way that you can make the argument is incorporating Jewish law for the 21st century and making it the way it should be, which is humanizing it and making sure that it's not hurting people. Because there was a gap where people were using the lack of technology when it came to Jewish law and exploiting the technology because they could get on an airplane and get away. So that's coming to an end, which is good. But again, it's a world that we're living in that you and I'll finish again where we began. You and I are oftentimes observing this and we're not living it. So if you watch Shtisel on television, or if you watched Unorthodox, or if you watch these different shows that focus on the Orthodox world, you feel like you're glimpsing into a world that kind of is foreign to you. But yes, for literally, hundreds of thousands of Jews, they are living under Torah law, and that law is operational on a daily basis. And these are not theoretical or interesting things for them to read. This is their life. These are the decisions that they live by. And these answers that they get, these responsa, they have big effects on their lives.
Yeah.
And the last thing I will say is that one of the reasons why we don't live like this is because once we were living under, thank God, a law in this country, which let's say this right now, we need to protect it, and we need to make sure that it continues to function as a law for everybody, to protect everybody, to protect us by the law of constitutional law, by civil codes. Need those laws. Jewish law was one of the only things that would protect us. And in the Reform and conservative worlds and non-Orthodox world, we do have those laws to protect us, which keep us safe and give us good guidance. But I will say that that when we look at these laws, they definitely still provide us, ethical guidance, and they definitely should give us some direction, especially when it comes to our day-to-day behaviors, which I hope don't get influenced too much by constitutional law and by American law, because our forefathers in this country were actually fairly, they were fairly brilliant when they came up with laws that would hopefully not encroach too much on the personal sphere. So something to keep in mind as we wrap up today. I want to thank everybody for being here in person and online.
Hey, Rabbi, I got a quick question.
Yes.
Are there some people who live in they live with parallel laws, like, the justice system and then the Jewish law at the same time?
Yeah, they do. Now, I will just answer that question honestly. There are people who will tell you, as the old Hebrew National commercial said, we answer to a higher authority. There are people who believe that they don't have to follow American law sometimes because they're following Jewish law. That is not the case. Jewish law articulates this perfectly in the Talmud, where it says Dina Malchuta Dina, which literally means the law of your king, the law of your kingdom. It's Malchuta, which means the king or kingdom. Dina Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. And so you're not allowed to abrogate the law by saying, I don't follow that law, I follow the Jewish law. The local law is you must follow that. And the Orthodox rabbis will tell you that this doesn't get you off the hook. They will tell you that in the areas where sometimes these things come into play against each other, it's not, we can't just say we can abrogate the American law in order to get something done. So, again, when it comes to divorce and it comes to those kinds of things, thank God we have laws in this country that protect spouses, because for most of human history, there were no laws that protected a woman when she got divorced, except for Jewish law, except for the laws of ketubah and the gitin, the laws of marriage according to Jewish law. Like you saw those, we didn't go through those tractates, but those laws protected a woman, and there was no law in this country that protected women in divorce until about 75 years ago, 60 and 70, 60, 70 years ago. So keep that in mind when we talk about the law in from the Jewish standpoint. There was a period of time for I would say most of human history, where you were much better off under Jewish law than you were under the law of the land. So thankfully we live in let's keep it that way. We live in a
But
country, a land of law.
regarding
Thank you.
the
Yeah.
issue of divorce and gets and so on, Monday night we lit a yahrzeit candle for my paternal grandmother. She was married. Things were pretty rough in what is now Moldova. They gave her husband some money, sent him to America to explore and maybe get himself a home, and then send for the rest of the family. And 5, 6, 7 years later, they still hadn't heard word from him. And there was no getting a get. He was gone. And they couldn't. He didn't have an internet address back in the late 1800s. So my grandmother and her father went to the rabbi, and they said, well, he must be dead. He was declared dead, and she remarried my grandfather. So,
Well,
there you go. There you go. And that, by the way, I have to tell you, you had to go to a rabbi who you knew would do that, because there were other rabbis who would be very, what we call machmir, very strict on it. And they said, unless we have testimony that the person died, we can't do it. And so people knew which rabbis they could go to. Now you can't go to different rabbis for different answers. You got to go to your rabbi. You got to go to your local rabbi. You got to go to that person. But
you can't form shop.
yeah, people knew which rabbis were more lenient and which ones, were strict. Again, it's a moot point now, because people will just say, what do I even care? I'm a Reformed Jew. And that's one of the reasons why this is kind of a moot point and that's one of the reasons, by the way, why the Orthodox have become so stringent, is because of the Reform and conservative movements. It's because they know that we're out there, if you will, and the alternative for people nowadays is just to say, what do I care whether the guy's gone? I don't need that community anymore. I don't need to live in that community where people will say I'm still married. I'm just gonna not live in that community. So that's one of the reasons why, there's such, if you will, hostility to the Reform and conservative movements, because essentially we also make it. I'm not going to say we make it irrelevant, but we've essentially taken the place of the more lenient rabbis, and we've done it in a way where it becomes irrelevant. So yeah, I'll just leave you with this, folks. When people who are part of Chabad need to have somebody perform a marriage for their kids, when they marry somebody who's not Jewish, they can't go to Choni. That's all I'm going to tell you.
Yeah.
And that's true. And that's happened numerous times. It happened 5 weeks ago. So I can tell you it works. Our community works. We have respect for each other. I'm not saying it's like that in every community, but we figured out a way to make it work, and we respect each other, and we know what one person will do and what generally what somebody won't do, but you know, maybe that's the future. You know, the future of the Jewish community is going to be people who can respect each other and work together. And again, that comes with not looking down at each other and not you know, making fun of somebody and you know, it means not thinking that somebody, because they do something differently, is an idiot, and somebody who, if they don't do something, is not really Jewish. There has to be certain basic ideas you know, this is all predicated on those things. But if it works, and it can work, I can tell you it's worked for 25 years. If it works, it's a wonderful thing, and a Jewish community can function and I think, you know, people can have a place. But it takes a certain mentality, and again, it's not humiliating people, and it's not deriding people. All right, folks, take care.
Thank you.
Good
We'll
night.
Thanks, Rabbi.
see you soon. Friday night
Hey,
service.
thank you.
Friday night
See you
service.
Friday
Beth.
night.
Thanks,
All right, bye-bye.
Rabbi.